In just 31 seconds, one of the biggest music legends in history went from smiling guest to absolutely furious, storming off set after the host pushed him too far. What started as a friendly chat turned into a screaming match that left the entire studio in complete shock, cameras rolling as Paul McCartney had enough of Lorraine Kelly's relentless questions and disrespectful attitude. Before we get into this explosive story, make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals. You won't want to miss what happens next. Last night's episode of Lorraine was supposed to be a celebration. Paul McCartney, the man who wrote some of the most beloved songs in history, was sitting on that famous yellow sofa, ready to talk about his latest project. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement. These were people who grew up listening to the Beatles, who had his records on their shelves, who sang his songs at weddings and parties. They couldn't believe they were in the same room as him. Lorraine Kelly walked onto set with her usual bright smile, waving to the crowd. She was wearing a blue dress and seemed thrilled to have such a massive guest on her show. Paul sat down, looking relaxed in a dark jacket and casual shirt. He smiled at the audience, gave a little wave, and settled into his seat. "Paul McCartney, everyone," Lorraine announced, and the audience erupted in applause. Paul nodded graciously, that familiar grin on his face. He'd done thousands of interviews over the decades. This should have been easy. "Thank you for having me," Paul said warmly. "Oh, we're absolutely delighted you're here," Lorraine replied, leaning forward with enthusiasm. "Now, you've got new music out, which is wonderful. But I have to say, I've been dying to ask you about some other things too." Paul nodded. "Sure. Fire away." The first few minutes went smoothly. They talked about his recording process, about how he still loved making music after all these years. Paul was charming and funny, telling little stories that made the audience laugh. He talked about his grandchildren, about how music had changed since the 60s. Everything seemed perfectly fine. But then Lorraine's tone shifted slightly. "You know, Paul," she said, her smile still in place but her voice taking on a different edge, "there's something I've always wondered. When you look back at the Beatles, do you ever feel like you were in John's shadow?" The audience went quiet. Paul's smile flickered for just a second. It was a question he'd been asked a million times, phrased a million different ways, and he'd always handled it with grace. "Well, Lorraine," he said carefully, "John and I were partners. We wrote together. We created together. There was no shadow. We were a team." "Yes. But come on," Lorraine pressed, leaning even closer. "Everyone knows John was the clever one, the artistic one. You were more of the pretty face, weren't you?" A few people in the audience gasped. Paul's expression hardened slightly, but he kept his composure. "I don't think that's accurate," he said, his voice still polite but firmer now. "John and I both contributed equally to what we created. We respected each other's talents. But the songs that really mattered," Lorraine continued, ignoring his discomfort, "like Imagine, like Working Class Hero, those were all John, weren't they? Your songs were more fluffy, obla-dee, obla-da, and all that." Paul sat back in his chair, and you could see the shift in his body language. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been relaxed on his lap, now gripped the armrest. "Lorraine, I wrote Yesterday," he said, his voice low. "I wrote Let It Be. I wrote Hey Jude. These aren't fluffy songs." "Oh, I know," Lorraine said, waving her hand dismissively. "But they're not exactly groundbreaking, are they? They're nice. They're sweet. But John's work had depth." The audience was completely silent now. People were exchanging uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the fun, light-hearted interview they'd expected. The camera operators kept filming, unsure of what to do. Paul leaned forward, his face serious now. "I think you're being incredibly disrespectful, not just to me, but to John's memory. We loved each other. We respected each other's work. What you're doing right now is creating some kind of competition that never existed." "I'm just asking questions," Lorraine said defensively, but there was a sharpness in her voice now too. "Questions that a lot of people have thought about." "Then a lot of people don't know what they're talking about," Paul shot back. His legendary patience was clearly wearing thin. Lorraine laughed. But it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made everything worse. "Oh, come on, Paul. Don't get all sensitive on us. You're a big boy. You can handle a little critique. Critique? Paul's voice rose slightly. This isn't critique. This is you trying to tear down my life's work on your morning show for what? Ratings? Don't flatter yourself, Lorraine snapped. And now the facade of friendliness was completely gone. This show was doing just fine before you got here. The audience was stunned. People's mouths hung open. This was Lorraine Kelly, the woman who was supposed to be warm and welcoming, the friendly face of morning television, and she was being absolutely vicious to one of the most beloved musicians in the world. Paul stood up slightly from his seat, then sat back down, clearly trying to control himself. Look, I came here to talk about my new album, to have a nice conversation. I didn't come here to be insulted. You're being too sensitive, Lorraine said, crossing her arms. This is exactly what people say about you, you know. That you can't take criticism, that you're living off the Beatles' legacy and you get upset when anyone points it out. Paul's face went red. You could see decades of frustration bubbling to the surface. He'd been nothing but gracious his entire career, handled countless ridiculous questions, put up with endless comparisons and criticisms, and he'd always taken the high road. But everyone has a breaking point. Living off the Beatles' legacy? He repeated, his voice shaking with anger now. I am the Beatles' legacy. I wrote half those songs. I played bass, I played piano, I arranged, I produced, and I've been making music for 60 bloody years since then. What have you done, Lorraine? What's your legacy? Asking rude questions on a morning chat show? The audience gasped again. Some people actually applauded. They'd never seen Paul like this, but they also couldn't believe what Lorraine had been saying to him. Lorraine's face flushed. She clearly hadn't expected him to fight back like this. How dare you speak to me like that on my own show? How dare you speak to me like that at all? Paul shouted. And now he was fully standing. I've been nothing but respectful. I came here as a favor, because my people said it would be good promotion, and you've done nothing but try to belittle me from the moment I sat down. If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you shouldn't do interviews, Lorraine said coldly. Tough questions? Paul laughed, but there was no humor in it. Tough questions are about creativity, about process, about meaning. What you're doing is just being nasty. There's a difference, and if you can't see that, then you shouldn't be hosting a show. Lorraine stood up too now, her face furious. Get out, get off my show. Oh, I'm going, Paul said, already reaching to unclip his microphone. Trust me, I don't want to be here another second. Good, we don't need you. You're the one who begged me to come on, Paul shot back, pulling the microphone pack off his belt and tossing it onto the sofa. Your producers called my people 6 times. That's not true, Lorraine shouted. But her face said otherwise. It absolutely is true, Paul said, his voice cold now. And I said no twice, because I had a feeling something like this might happen. But they promised me you'd be professional. They promised me this would be a positive interview. And instead, you've spent the entire time trying to tear me down. The audience didn't know whether to watch or look away. Some people had their phones out, recording everything. The producers were probably losing their minds in the control room. But the cameras kept rolling. I've been nothing but fair, Lorraine insisted, but her voice wavered. Fair? Paul's voice rose again. You told me I was in John's shadow. You called my songs fluffy. You said I was just a pretty face. In what world is that fair? I was representing what people think, Lorraine said defensively. No, you were representing what you think, Paul corrected her. And honestly, Lorraine, your opinion means absolutely nothing to me. I've had a career that most people can only dream of. I've made music that will be listened to long after both of us are gone. And you'll be remembered for this. For being cruel to a guest on your own show. Lorraine's hands were shaking now. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. Get out. Seriously, get out. I'm going, Paul said. And good luck getting anyone decent to come on this show after this. Because trust me, word spreads fast. He turned to the audience, and his face softened slightly. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry you had to witness this. You all seem lovely. Several people in the audience started applauding. Then more joined in. Within seconds, nearly the entire studio audience was clapping and cheering for Paul. Some people were even standing up, Lorraine looked around in disbelief. "Sit down! Stop that!" But nobody listened to her. They kept clapping as Paul walked toward the exit, his head held high. A few people near the aisle reached out to touch his hand or pat his shoulder as he passed. He smiled at them, nodding his thanks. "This is my show!" Lorraine shouted over the applause, but her voice was lost in the noise. Paul reached the stage exit and paused for just a moment. He turned back, and even though his face was still angry, there was a sadness in his eyes too. "You know what the real shame is, Lorraine?" he called out. "I actually used to like your show. I used to think you were kind. I guess I was wrong." And with that, he walked off the set. The audience continued clapping, some people whistling and cheering. Lorraine stood there, frozen, clearly having no idea what to do next. Her producers were probably screaming in her earpiece, but she just stared at the empty space where Paul had been sitting. "Well," she finally said, her voice shaky, trying to regain some control, "that was unexpected. We'll take a quick break." But the damage was done. The audience's applause turned to murmurs, people talking amongst themselves about what they'd just witnessed. You could hear fragments of conversation. "I can't believe she spoke to him like that. What was she thinking? That was so disrespectful. Poor Paul." Lorraine walked off the stage during the break, her head down, and the cameras finally stopped rolling. But those cameras had captured everything, every insult, every moment of tension, every second of one of the most uncomfortable interviews in British television history. In the hallway outside the studio, Paul was surrounded by apologetic staff members. His own team was there too, looking furious on his behalf. Someone offered him water. Someone else apologized profusely, saying they had no idea that was going to happen. "It's all right," Paul said quietly, though he still looked shaken. "These things happen, but I won't be coming back." Meanwhile, back in the studio, the audience wasn't settling down. People were still talking, still processing what they'd seen. Some were checking their phones, probably already texting friends about what had happened. Others were debating amongst themselves whether what Lorraine said was out of line. But the consensus was clear. Almost everyone agreed that she had gone too far. When the show came back from break, Lorraine tried to continue as if nothing had happened. She introduced her next guest with forced cheerfulness, but you could hear the strain in her voice. The audience's energy was completely different now. They were subdued, uncomfortable. Nobody wanted to be there anymore. The next guest, an author promoting a cookbook, sat down nervously. She'd clearly been told what happened. Lorraine tried to conduct a normal interview, asking about recipes and cooking tips, but it was awkward. Everything felt wrong. The natural flow of the show had been destroyed. "So, your chocolate cake recipe," Lorraine said, trying so hard to sound upbeat. "Tell us what makes it special." The author answered, but kept glancing toward the exit, probably wondering if she should just leave too. The interview limped along for a few painful minutes before Lorraine wrapped it up early. "Thank you so much," she said, rushing through her closing remarks. "That's all we have time for today. Thank you for watching." The credits rolled, but instead of the usual cheerful music and waving at the camera, Lorraine just stood up and walked off set without another word. The audience filed out in near silence, everyone still talking about what they'd witnessed. Outside the studio building, Paul McCartney climbed into a waiting car. A small crowd had gathered, people who'd heard the commotion or seen staff members rushing around looking panicked. When they saw Paul, they started calling out to him. "We love you, Paul. You did the right thing. Don't let her get to you." Paul waved to them through the car window, managing a small smile despite everything. His manager sat beside him, already on the phone, probably doing damage control or maybe just telling everyone what had happened. As the car pulled away, Paul looked back at the studio one last time. He'd been on hundreds of shows, in dozens of countries, over more than 6 decades in the spotlight. He'd handled difficult interviewers before, people who asked uncomfortable questions or tried to create controversy. But this was different. This wasn't journalism or even tabloid sensationalism. This was just plain cruelty disguised as entertainment. "Are you okay?" his manager asked, putting down the phone. Paul was quiet for a moment, watching the London streets pass by outside the window. "Yeah," he finally said. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just disappointed, you know. I thought it would be nice. A fun morning chat about music." "She was completely out of line," his manager said firmly. "Everyone's going to be on your side with this one." Paul nodded but didn't say anything else. He wasn't interested in sides or public opinion battles. He just wanted to make music, to share his art with people who appreciated it. He was too old and too accomplished to waste energy on negativity. But back at the studio, the fallout was already beginning. Staff members were gathering in hushed groups, talking about what they'd seen. Some were shocked, others were defending Lorraine, saying Paul had overreacted. But most seemed to understand that something had gone very wrong. In her dressing room, Lorraine sat alone, staring at herself in the mirror. Her makeup was smudged from stress, sweating under the studio lights. She knew this was bad. Really bad. You could see it in her face. The realization that she'd made a terrible mistake. Her producer knocked on the door. "Lorraine, we need to talk." "Not now," she called out, her voice hoarse. "Lorraine, this is serious. The phones are already ringing. Social media is exploding. We need to figure out what we're going to say." But Lorraine didn't answer. She just kept staring at her reflection, replaying the conversation in her head. Had she really said those things? Had she really called his music fluffy? Told him he was in John Lennon's shadow? What had she been thinking? The truth was, she hadn't been thinking. She'd gotten caught up in trying to make good television, trying to create a moment, trying to push boundaries. But she'd pushed too far, and against the wrong person. Paul McCartney wasn't some reality TV star or controversial politician who thrived on conflict. He was a living legend who'd always been gracious and kind, and she'd treated him like garbage. Meanwhile, the footage was already leaking. People in the audience had recorded portions of the argument on their phones. Within an hour, clips were circulating online. Within 2 hours, it was trending. Everyone had an opinion. And almost all of them were criticizing Lorraine. "Can't believe Lorraine Kelly treated Paul McCartney like that," one tweet read. "Just watched the clip of Paul walking off Lorraine's show. She was absolutely vile to him," said another. "Lorraine Kelly owes Paul McCartney a massive apology," someone else posted. The studio's official social media accounts were being flooded with angry comments. People were demanding apologies, demanding explanations, demanding that something be done. The show's producers were in emergency meetings, trying to figure out how to handle the situation, but the damage was already done. In less than an hour, one of the most respected and beloved musicians in the world had been pushed to his breaking point by a host who'd forgotten the basic rules of respect and decency. And everyone had seen it happen. Back in the car, Paul's phone was buzzing constantly. Friends calling to check on him, fellow musicians expressing their support. Even people he hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out. He ignored most of them, not ready to talk about it yet. "You should probably say something," his manager suggested gently. "Just a brief statement. Let people know you're okay." Paul shook his head. "Not yet. Maybe not at all. The whole thing speaks for itself, doesn't it?" And it did. The footage, the audience reaction, the way he'd maintained his dignity even while defending himself, it all painted a clear picture. This wasn't a he said, she said situation where the truth was murky. This was documented, recorded, witnessed by hundreds of people. At her home later that evening, Lorraine's phone wouldn't stop ringing either. But her calls were different. They were from her boss, from the network executives, from her publicist, all wanting to know what the hell had happened and what they were going to do about it. She tried to explain herself, tried to say she was just doing her job as an interviewer. But even as the words came out, she knew how hollow they sounded. There was a difference between tough questions and personal attacks, and she'd crossed that line spectacularly. "We're going to have to address this," her boss said firmly. "Tomorrow's show, you need to apologize." "Apologize for what?" Lorraine asked, though her heart wasn't in the defiance. "For asking questions. For being unnecessarily cruel to one of the most beloved musicians in the world," her boss said bluntly. "For making our show look terrible. For driving away a massive guest in the middle of an interview. Take your pick." Lorraine knew he was right. But the idea of apologizing, of admitting she was wrong on national television, made her stomach turn. Still, what choice did she have? The next morning, the story was everywhere. Newspapers, websites, morning shows, everyone was talking about the confrontation. Most of the coverage was sympathetic to Paul, painting him as the victim of an unprovoked attack by a host who'd let her ego get in the way of doing her job properly. Some headlines read, "Paul McCartney walks off Lorraine after host's cruel comments." Others said, Lorraine Kelly's shocking treatment of Beatles legend sparks outrage. One particularly harsh tabloid went with, how Lorraine killed her career in 47 seconds. Through all of this, Paul remained quiet. He didn't give interviews about the incident. He didn't post on social media. He didn't release a statement through his publicist. He simply went about his business, working on his music, spending time with his family, living his life. Because that was the thing about Paul McCartney. He'd survived the Beatles breaking up. He'd survived losing Linda. He'd survived decades of criticism, comparison, and scrutiny. One bad interview with a morning show host wasn't going to break him. He was bigger than that. His legacy was secure. But for Lorraine, the silence from Paul's camp was almost worse than if he'd fought back publicly. His refusal to engage made her look even more petty, more mean-spirited. If he'd gotten into a war of words with her, they could have both looked bad. But his dignity in walking away made the contrast between them even starker. In the weeks that followed, the incident became a case study in how not to conduct an interview. Broadcasting students analyzed the footage, breaking down exactly where Lorraine went wrong. Public relations experts used it as an example of how quickly a situation can spiral out of control. Media ethics professors debated whether her questions crossed professional boundaries. And Paul McCartney? He released his new album to critical acclaim, did interviews with other shows and publications who treated him with the respect he deserved, and continued to be the living legend he'd always been. But that morning, in that studio, when he'd stood up, torn off his microphone, and walked away from Lorraine Kelly's abuse, he'd reminded everyone of something important. Fame and success don't give anyone the right to be treated poorly. Respect is earned, and it goes both ways, host and guest, interviewer and subject, person to person. As Paul's car had pulled away from the studio that day, driving through the London streets, he'd looked out at the city he'd helped define through his music. He thought about all the interviews he'd done over the years, all the questions he'd answered patiently, all the times he'd been kind when he could have been difficult, and he knew he'd done the right thing. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. Sometimes you have to walk away. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept disrespect, no matter who it's coming from. The car turned a corner, and the studio disappeared from view. Paul never looked back.